All right. We want to get to the point now where we answer the question as to why or how the Cold War finally came to an end. And so, a few things we're going to look at. One, we left off in our timeline activity with the invasion of Afghanistan in 1979. Try to reestablish a pro-communist government. When they invaded Afghanistan, that's what they were trying to do. Well, we had been in a period of good friendly relations with the Soviet Union in a period called détente. If you didn't do that in the timeline, it was after, it's kind of Vietnam War, the Korean War, the Cuban Missile Crisis. We've had all these problems and all this high tension with the Soviet Union and the president, the leaders of these countries, they decided to just say, hey, let's just kind of calm down. Let's try to, we're building more nuclear weapons, more powerful nukes. Let's start reducing our military, let's start reducing our nuclear arsenal, and let's just take it easy. Let's just calm down a little bit. And so they were on this period of relaxed tensions between the two sides, but that ended in 1979. So that's where we are going to pick up from here. A guy by the name of Ronald Reagan is going to get elected to be the president. And he is very anti-communist. He wants to kind of get this thing going, and he wants to kind of go right at the Soviet Union, um, which he calls the evil empire. And so he's going to create new weapons, neutron bomb. He's going to create these defense measures known as Star Wars, which is really was more unrealistic than anything. But the Soviet Union kind of viewed this as a threat. With him kind of ramping up the arms race all over again, which they had been limiting for a long time. And so the Soviet Union, their economy is ailing. They're having a hard time keeping pace with the arms race that the United States is partaking in. And they spent millions in weaponry that they could never, that they obviously weren't even going to use. And there was a shortage of supply of most basic goods. So changes had to be made, and the the Soviet Union, once again, the big problem with the Soviet Union is that it's a command economy and that it's a communist society where the government takes control over all the wealth and distributes it to look out for the basic needs of the people. Well, in the United States, we've got all sorts of we don't have the government in control of those things. We have um, consumer choice and competition, and we have all these different avenues of games and things you can play. You can buy all these different smartphones, and you can have all these different types of cars, and you can do all these different types of things uh, based on the society that we have. And so while we have a lot of really, let's be honest, kind of useless things like, oh man, look how awesome I am at this game. It's like, well, nobody cares. Uh, but we have all these useless things, but really it helps our economy. It creates competition, it creates consumer choice, it creates markets, and so our economy has traditionally always done better overall than obviously communist societies for that reason. And so they realized we got to make some changes. And they had all sorts of problems happening as well. Drugs and alcohol were prevalent. Um, they're starting to get outdated. Their industries and farms are getting outdated. Nothing was probably more obvious of that than the meltdown at Chernobyl. They had a nuclear meltdown, one of their nuclear plants, kind of like Davis-Besse. Melted down. I don't know the total numbers of Chernobyl, how many people died, um, but it obviously left that area uninhabitable. I had a buddy who did a lot of research on that. He told me, he's like, the stuff that they did, he said they would have people just go up to that nuclear site and start removing some of the rubble without having any protective gear on. He's like, and they would go home and their hair would fall out and they'd die that day just from having so much exposure to radiation. I'm like, wow, that's crazy. Um, but the Soviet Union has realized there's something we need to do to survive. And so what they do is they get this guy named Mikhail Gorbachev. He's going to come into power, and this guy is reformer. He has reforms in mind. He is very reformer minded, wants to make changes, not afraid to shake things up from the way they were, because things frankly aren't going that well in the Soviet Union right now. And so he's going to do a couple things that are going to uh, really weaken the Soviet Union. Perestroika. He's going to give businesses the opportunity to be privately owned and operated. And this is going to really put a dent in that idea of communism. All right, well, perestroika, excuse me, is one of the reforms that he's going to make, and you're going to have to know that as well. And because he realized he wanted to make all these changes, but he's like, and one of the things he also realized is, with these changes, I can't just make economic reforms. We need to make political reforms as now. So he instituted this glasnost, which is openness. People had more freedoms. People had more ability. People could now speak out against communism, which what we've talked about so far, that's a no-no. You can't speak out against communism. The communist dictators rule with an iron fist usually, and and they had been released. Obviously, Stalin was ruthless, and Khrushchev maybe a little more lenient, but either way, you get the idea that now you have this openness. People are going to have freedoms. Soviet Union began having elected officials, and so he made a lot of changes to the Soviet Union, try to keeping it powerful. But really what happened is that it's going to end up having a reverse effect. Gorbachev comes into power. The Cold War is going to come to an end pretty abruptly. He and Reagan are going to get along really well. They're going to make, they have a really good relationship with each other. They're going to try to make all sorts of changes. They're going to agree to rebuild, to reduce the military budgets, focus on domestic problems. And then a big thing that Gorbachev's going to do, which is going to really kill the Soviet Union and their influence, he's going to stop giving support to Eastern European countries. He's like, we got to fix our own problems. I'm not going to support Eastern Europe. We're no longer going to kind of give them our support. They're free to choose whatever they want. If they want to stay communist, great. If not, that's okay. We're not going to interfere. And that is going to, because, on the timeline, one of the other events that you had to look at was the Soviet Union invasion of Czechoslovakia, which was a Soviet satellite state. And that should have created some tension, because obviously the United States is swore to protect the spread of communism, and anybody that wants to fight an armed invasion, well, when the Soviet Union invades Czechoslovakia for making all these reforms, put the United States in a bind. But anyway, this Czechoslovakia is making all these reforms. They're making all these changes, and who's there to be like, no, you need to fall in line? It's the Soviet Union. And so anytime anything happened in Eastern Europe, the Soviet Union with their military might and the Warsaw Pact would just march in and be like, what we got going on here, fellas? Let's reduce this. We're gonna switch this. Otherwise, things are gonna get bad for you. And so with Gorbachev now saying that the Soviet Union will no longer do that, will no longer step in and give military support for these countries, one by one, they're going to start to fall. All right, so we got Poland. They're going to have strikes, and by June of '88, the communist government is going to be defeated in free elections. You're going to have Hungary in '89. You're going to have East Germany is going to fall, and eventually the Berlin Wall will come down, and in 1991, East and West Germany will be united for the first time since before World War II. So that's been pretty recent. Czechoslovakia is going to later that year, in November. Once again, you can kind of just see this domino effect. Romania, this guy was the most brutal of them. He hung on to power as much as he could. Eventually, he is going to get killed. But you see the idea here, with the Soviet Union now kind of faltering in their support of these areas, and no longer, saying we will no longer intervene. You can see one by one they start dropping like flies, and no longer are going to become communist. And so the Soviet Union is going to lose a lot of their influence, a lot of their sway. And so with the decentralization of the Soviet Union, many Soviet republics were going to demand their independence as well. Just as Gorbachev's reform led the Soviet satellites to reject communism, whoops, many ethnic groups within the Soviet Union also began to demand their independence. They see the blood in the water. They see the weakness of the Soviet Union and of Gorbachev and his reforms, and people want to start rushing to Russian. Want to start Russian. Get it? Oh, Russia. Sorry. Are going to start to try to break free of the Soviet Union. And we're actually seeing problems with this right now. And you see one of these countries that's created, Ukraine right here. You see Ukraine right there. Ukraine is created out of the Soviet Union. They it used to be kind of one unified country. Well, now all these other countries have broken off. Well, Russia's trying to take back Ukraine. Uh, you know, pro you know pro Russian, can't not separate. I don't know, but basically, pro-Russian forces in Ukraine are trying to, the Russians are trying to kind of acquire some of their territory back, and there's all sorts of fighting that was breaking out for a long time. Like, whoa, what's the West going to do with Russia? They put sanctions on them, but all that fighting took place because Russia kind of is thinking like, hey, we want some of our territory back. But here's what it looks like. Here was the USSR beforehand, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republic, and you got all these new countries that are created. Read them fast, you'll have to memorize them all. I'm just kidding. But you can see there's obviously a big chunk of the Soviet Union is now been reduced. You got Kazakhstan and Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Belarus, Ukraine, etc. This is all now. These are these 15 republics that were part of the Soviet Union over here in the gold. They are now their own independent countries. And one by one, that's not going to happen overnight, obviously. That's going to happen little by little, by little. And so you can see, once again, this is a political cartoon kind of showing that with the USSR sinking, 15 new countries get created out of USSR. Once again, a lot of times people use the term Soviet Union synonymous with Russia, and technically it's not true because there are republics that made up the Soviet Union. So Russia is going to become its own country, and these other 15 little republics are going to be created as their own country as well. And so the end of Gorbachev and the era and the end of the Soviet Union, a coup to overthrow Gorbachev wasn't entirely successful. However, it lessened Gorbachev's power and influence because he made all these reforms. People wanted to try to get him out. Basically, to make a long story short, Gorbachev is going to end up resigning on December 25th, 1991. He's going to turn responsibilities over to Boris Yeltsin, and Yeltsin's going to become the first president. He's going to introduce a free market economy, and this marked the end of the Soviet Union, one of the largest empires, one of the largest empires the world has ever seen. And it's going to effectively end the Cold War. And so with that, now we get thrown into present day, which is where, like I said, we have Russia. We have Vladimir Putin in charge in Russia, and people fear he's trying to kind of get the old band back together, the old Soviet Union. That might be his end game. But anyway, that's how the Cold War ended. A couple radical reforms. The arms race. Whoa. The arms race helped out. The United States economy helped put stress on the Soviet economy. They realized, hey, we need to make changes. They start making radical changes. People see weakness, and one by one, these countries and republics start to gain their independence from the Soviet Union, which will eventually lead to it to collapse, and we get left with Russia. That's it.